Okay, this session is a session that is very close to my heart, and it's one that helped me gain my National Teaching Fellowship last year for the Higher Education Academy. So I want to share with you heartfelt journey that I've been on for the last 10 years, but at the same time I also want to give you a bit of an experience of what students feel as they're going through a Brian Smith session, whether that's research or whether that's looking at technology and so forth. But first of all, I should really start by introducing a couple of colleagues in the audience and their role today, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about myself, and I'll take you through this particular presentation. Alan C2.
Hi,
that's Alan. Alan, would you like to say a few words?
All right, yeah. Well, first of all, as Brian said, I'm very delighted to be here today to share with you some of our experience in e-learning. I came from a background, I'm not going to tell you the full story about my life, but I came from a background initially working in advertising. And then I moved into information technology, and I've been with Edgehill University for the last 8 years. And initially, my role was supporting voluntary organization to look at how e-learning can help them develop. Then 2 years ago, I joined Brian's team as one of the learning technologists in the Faculty of Health and Social Care. Brian will probably tell you a little bit more about our team, but what I'm trying to contribute today is, apart from my understanding of the pedagogy, because all our team, our colleagues have all have the PG cert to look into how pedagogy can help e-learning design, as well as contribute from the practitioner level. Myself and 3 other colleagues, we're working full-time for the team to develop e-learning content for both internal module as well as for our enterprise clients. So hopefully we are able to contribute from that perspective.
And what Alan doesn't tell you is that the team that we've got is an exceptionally gifted team, and I am actually proud to be the head of department for that team. It's them who make me who I am today. And Alan is one of the leading lights in the department. They help me to really understand my thinking before I can go and present. So he's very humble. He won't say that. I'll say it for him. Thank you, Alan.
Don't believe that.
And my other colleague in the audience is David Physick. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David. This is my first time back at UEL for about 6 years. I did a master's in psychology here when up there in Stratford. So seeing all these new facilities is wonderful. My background is I grew up in Liverpool. I worked 27 years for Barclays Bank. I finished my time there as the group's customer relations director, and now I wear a number of hats in the field of management consultancy. I'm really interested through my psychology studies in the whole arena of behaviours, how do people need to behave in all organisations to create an environment where people feel motivated to give their all to what they're doing, be that in work, be that in schools. A couple of my colleagues have been doing work in schools, both with school leadership teams, both with the pupils, in helping them understand where they come from behaviourally. Technologically, well, I started work when you changed the program on a computer in the bank with a punched paper tape. So, when I look at what Brian's using today, I'm just bowled over. So I look forward to having a really active, exciting and stimulating conversation this afternoon.
Thank you, David. And what David doesn't say is that the aspect that I have with David is that David critiques me as an individual, not for teaching purposes, but for personal growth. Look at my behaviour, my attitudes, my predispositions to help me become a leader of the future and be able to inspire people to actually take technology and put it in such a way that means something significant that will change an individual's life. So thank you, David, for the contribution so far, and we'll continue with that. Now, this is me. So I'm at Edgehill University, which is a very thriving organisation in the middle of Ormskirk near Southport. We've just almost tripled in size of footprint. but we too have a very strong passion around e-learning as well as online education across all campuses. So we take the e-learning quite seriously. We look at simulation, the old method and the new methods, and we make sure that we apply it to our practice. I also have a National Teaching Fellowship. I'm a University Learning and Teaching Fellow, and I like to think technology enhanced learning is about the ology part, the study of, not about the bells and whistles, more about the behaviorisms and the attitudes that we can instill in our teachers, but also how we can make sure we get the point across to our students for the future. My focus is on immersive learning. And what I mean by immersive learning, this is a 3D world for me, this room in itself. There's a number of things that are taking place on a subconscious and an unconscious level. And what I like to try and distill is understand what's in there and create that same effect for the students, whether it's in a classroom or whether it's online, distance learning. And also, my PhD that I'm studying by publication is about education without walls. And that will become clearer as I go through this presentation. So, one of the things that is of particular interest for me is how sound is sometimes left off the actual presentation in any online environment, as well as the classroom. And this particular sound will come back to you later on in this presentation because it signifies that there's something important. When you get these presentation slides, there is something hidden in the slides that would challenge you to find out where they are, and what those things are and where they are. And the Twitter feed that we have, you can use during the session or afterwards to tell us what you found and where any questions pop up for you. So this is divided into 3 parts of this presentation. Scene setting. We're going to outline what we're going to do. And then there's an Act 1. And if anybody hates role play, don't worry, we're not going to do role play. We're going to look at pedagogy. And we're going to try to understand pedagogy a bit clearer for when it comes to simulation, especially online practice. Act 2, we're going to look at the E part of pedagogy, the electronic part or the online part. So can you feasibly do a simulation in a physical environment that can be replicated in an online environment? Some people say you can, others say you can't, but we're going to try and dig deep and actually measure those conditions or identify those conditions that will help you do online simulation. So here's the outline. We're going to look at some pedagogy literature. We're going to touch on the fast-growing amount of technology available to teachers, which there's many of you will be aware of. There's certainly technologists in the room who will be aware of the plethora of technology out there and the confused state that we seem to be getting into sometimes. Which one do we use, this one compared to the next? But also the pedagogical application of the technology. And the caveat that I usually put into every presentation is it's not about the technology. It's about what you do with it, what you understand, what it will trigger, what emotions that you might likely trigger in an individual, what behaviorisms that you might be able to trigger also. So it's about what the application, the functionality of it can be within your pedagogical model. And that connects to the design principles. So it's what are the principles we are using with technology to simulate or stimulate learning to take place. Yeah. Now, simulation for many has been role play. But for others, it's something slightly different. And I'm going to try and make that clearer for you as I go through where my thinking is coming from. But first of all, these are some of the theories that I use in my pedagogical approach to teaching and learning. Now, some of you might say these are old. Yeah. If you look at Garnier, 1985, Garnier talked about the conditions of learning, and he categorized them to the point that we were able to use them in the classroom and look at how cognitive strategies and motor skills and attitudes can be deployed. But we've moved away, with other theories, we've moved away from it. But what I've done is I've gone back to Garnier and said, if those conditions are evident in a good teaching session in a classroom, can they be transposed to an online environment? Can they be transposed into a simulated environment also? We all understand that the pedagogical origin talks about leading the child, but does pedagogy today mean the same? Arguably, people would say it's morphic. I can take a poll in this room and ask, what does everybody understand by pedagogy? And I can guarantee you that I'll get at least 5, 6 different answers. Some people will relate to content, some people will relate to theoretical concepts, some people will talk about showing by example, modelling, and so forth. So what is it when we're doing online education that we need to understand about pedagogy? What theories are we actually using? Now, one of the theories that I've used over the years inherently, or certainly since 2002, is Diane Lorilard's theory around conversational framework. Is anybody aware of conversational frameworks? Diane's in University of London and a very eminent speaker who talks globally, very inspirational speaker. And what I like about her is that she really digs deep into what are the communications that take place online and how can they be categorized in such a way that you're able to take advantage of the anticipated communications. So in other words, if you've got a VLE, which I think your VLE is Moodle, it's becoming Moodle this year, you're transferring across, how are you going to take advantage of the asynchronous and synchronous chat features in Moodle? What I found in my research studies is that we expect conversation to take place. There's almost a right that if a student comes into a physical classroom, that we expect a conversation to take place, a discursive engagement. So we almost expect that as teachers when we go to an online discussion chat room. But what tends to happen is students don't engage. Yeah? How many people have had that experience? Yeah, I've had that in the early days. And when I found that, I wondered, what have I done wrong? I started to take that personally. And that was one of my behaviors that I had to overcome. And that was one of my emotions. That it wasn't me. It wasn't because I wasn't there enough for the student. What I soon realized is that the actual conversations that were taking place between me and the classroom were prompted by my presence, were prompted by my connection with the content. What happened in the online environment was that my presence was less in the online environment and it wasn't connected to the content. They were abstracts, they were separates. Yeah, a few nods in the crowd there. So what I had to do was go back to basics of what was my pedagogical model. How could I visualize it? How can I actually tie all those components together to create a constructive alignment? Yeah? Rather than, I'll do a bit of video here, a bit of chat here, separates, but they have to be connected. Yeah? So Diane Lorilard's work looks at that different types of conversations that take place between peer-to-peer, student to student, student to teacher, and predicts how you can actually take advantage of it in different settings for different purposes and means. So it's looking at the behaviorism, but it's also triggering it off the conversations that you're trying to create. So I'm going to take you through this and touch again on Diane's work because you know, she's such an inspiration. If you've never read her work or never listened to her speak, at the end of this slide there's references and there's a link to one of her presentations at, I think it was EDUCAUSE or Alt-C. It's worth watching, definitely worth watching. So, yeah.
And we'll get access to the slides.
Yes, you are, yeah. And that's a hyperlink at the bottom, as you probably noticed, yeah? Yeah, you can link on that, the paper will come up and show you and so forth.
Yeah, all the slides will go on our website, so publish the link.
Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Alan, any Twitter feeds?
Yeah, we got one about the golden eggs. You promised the golden eggs, you know, in your presentation.
The golden eggs?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we're all looking forward, you know, to seeing them.
Yeah, once you find them, once you have the slides and you've gone through the game of finding them and tweeted them to tell us where they are, we'll then send you a little prize. It may be a virtual prize or a physical. So it's worth knowing your theories that you subscribe to. There's an abundance of theories out there, but it's worth looking at the theories that are out there and what they do, so that you're aware of your own pedagogical model. Now, this might have come up last week with Derek. Yeah, with Derek. He might have talked about this paper about assessment and feedback by Nicola McFarlane in 2006. No?
I think so.
Did they not talk about this one? An exceptionally good piece of work, well worth reading, and yes, this one is hyperlinked too. Those are the 7 categories that they identified. Now, when you read them, you're probably going to go, yeah, that seems fair, that seems common sense, that's acceptable. Yeah, they are, and it's like I said, it's a very good piece of work. But when you look at their model, they transpose it into this type of diagram. And what this diagram does for you is gives you some sort of feeling of how it's been constructed verbally, but also diagrammatically. And what this model does, as well as many other models do, is they give you a generic approach, or they give you a feeling of how they've done it, but sometimes it's more difficult to actually replicate when it comes down to yourself. What I've seemed to have done over the years is being able to take a model and be able to deconstruct it slightly so that I can then say to colleagues out there that, okay, you're coming from the perspective that you have a face-to-face session, perhaps on research, perhaps on sports therapy, perhaps on business, or perhaps on psychology. You want to put it online. These are the simple steps. And we take them through simple steps so that it means that they are able to work with the technologists to actually get the strong pedagogical alignment that they require between content and theoretical processes. Definitely worth model looking at, but it's about finding your own model. It's about finding your own visual imagery that's going to help you replicate the sessions each time for an online environment. Yeah? A model's only good when you can actually physically replicate it. So here's my model. I'm going to lead into my model and where it comes from. And certainly with the simulated experience. Now, simulation for me as a child was about role play, playing cowboys and Indians in the garden, playing football with mates, you're being a goal scorer for Celtic, or Rangers, or who you're playing for. You acted out that role because you looked up to those individuals. You wanted to be those individuals. But I soon realized that role simulation or role play doesn't just happen in the physical football or Cowboys and Indians game. It also happens in board games. Monopoly was a very good simulated experience for me when it came around to making money and finding a strategy to deal with income versus expenditure, as I do now, and many of you are in those positions. And what I loved was, I always found my own strategy by going around the board game and waiting to read the players in front of me. I was looking at the faces and I was reading the visual clues as a child, and I was able to predict the next move by that individual. So I would then skip them, go to Marylebone and buy Marylebone, and get around the board to buy Mayfair every single time. So there was a bit of me. My pedagogical model was starting to form in my head at a very, very early age, looking at behaviorisms and looking at the psychological aspect of things. It also happened with the Rubik Cube. How many people had a Rubik Cube in their life? Yeah, we all did. Yeah. What was the outcome of doing the Rubik Cube? The outcome was you got the colours in the right order if you knew how to get the sequence, etc. Or the other outcome was you got frustrated and took it apart and threw it in the bin. Yeah? But what was happening there for me was another strategy started to form, was about tenacity, about sustaining power, but also a distance effect of understanding what was the purpose. Yeah? And that's what our students do online. They enter into the online world and they want to know up front, what's the purpose of being here? Yeah? So when you're looking at a simulated experience, if you're going to use the Rubik Cube, even in an online environment, you've got to say up front what the expectations are and what the end result is likely to be. We're getting into scaffolding learning. But scaffolding should be in such a way that it gives room for maneuverability and flexibility for the student's approach to learning. So back to the board games. These were very early for me, and certainly backgammon and chess at school. I played backgammon and chess at school, and again, it was more like a game of 3D poker because it was reading the player rather than reading the moves. So it gave me a great playground. Then I went into a healthcare background. I went to the health service. And this was probably the significant part of my career where I realized that simulation was extremely, extremely important. We had scenarios where a patient was being operated upon for an aortic aneurysm, appendectomy, could be any subject, any surgical area, and we would go through the real experience with the surgeons. We would listen to the nurses that passed the instruments, we ask questions, etc., so on. But then, when simulation came into practice, we tried to simulate the same scenario, but also look at the human factor elements, where mistakes occurred. Yeah, because you still hear today that sometimes there are errors in operations. It was the same 20 years ago. Where can simulation help to prevent errors for the future? And what I noticed when I was an educator was, a clinical educator, was that we mimicked road traffic accidents in a room, an educational room, much smaller than this. We mimicked them, but we left out vital information. And the vital information was the sounds. We didn't bring any sounds into the room. We didn't bring any passing traffic into the room, because in the operating theatre or on the roadside, there's passing traffic. So what we'd done was we took a real-life scenario, placed into a simulated room which was abstract from the real area, and we left out vital information that started to make people dissociated from the learning experience. They weren't immersed in the experience, they were abstract from the experience. So I wondered, I remember this quite well, I had a bunch of medical students who would come in and would look at me as if to say, it's a dummy, and what I was trying to say to them was, this is a dummy, this is a 48-year-old individual who is about 70 kilograms in weight and has just suddenly collapsed. I was asking them to act out a role that was completely alien to them because I hadn't put them into that conditions, the Garnier conditions. I hadn't got them in the state that they felt immersed into the experience. So that's what I mean by the old simulation. The new simulation is about picking up all the senses, the clues, the sounds, etc., and put them into the real practice today. Now, when you do that online, you certainly have to remember to put those experiences in place. You need the sounds. And I've got this theory as well that sometimes we try to take presentations, a classroom presentation, and we put it onto VLE, a Moodle, a Blackboard, or whatever you use, and it becomes two-dimensional. You lost the one dimension that's really important to most people. So it's about being cognizant of that and actually making sure that you try and capture everything that's in a 3D room and put it into a VLE or a 3D environment for immersive learning to take place, especially around simulation. It also gives you a chance, I remember quite well in the healthcare days that there was that community of practice. We all knew what we were trying to do. We were trying to save lives. We had people around us, so we had a sense of togetherness, although that when we weren't together, there would be differences of opinion. So there was a real bond or a real thread that kept us together in the real world, and we tried to do the same in the simulated world. Then as technology moved on, we were getting this sort of thing taking place. You were getting the hybrid approach between the technology, simulated technology, the real world as well. So this was done in the real world, but not in a virtual world. and you had the PC that allows you to see inside. So this is a camera that goes into the knee. Some of you might have had this done for arthroscopies. So you're able to see what was actually inside the knee and operate on that knee before you actually go into the operating department and operate on a real patient. Again, the difference here was we tried to put this in a simulated environment, but no passing traffic, no sounds at all. So you didn't get the same ambience that you required to make that individual immersed. And many medical students would come in and do a little bit on the plastic mannequin and then walk away. Hopefully they'll have gained something to take away and apply it to practice. But instead, what we did in this particular hospital is we changed the whole simulated suite around so it almost became its own operating theatre. So it was walking into a real live situation, but with a plastic mannequin operating. So again, it comes down to the behavioural senses. Then I saw this. And I love faces, as you can probably tell. Playing the chess game, playing the backgammon, seeing those faces. I then saw this face, and I wondered what this face was telling me. And this face stayed with me for many, many years. Not this actual face, this is a stock image, but this is the expression that I saw certainly in the 90s that stayed with me until recently I realized what it means. You would all agree that this looks like someone concentrating. Yeah? Probably someone engaged because of the way they're looking, the way their eyes are fixed. There's very little emotional response there, but there could be. The desire to succeed was another thing that was behind this. This was a surgeon operating. Those were the four factors that I extracted from that face. And I then thought to myself, what's that telling me? And I never worked out for a number of years until recently. That what that face is telling me is someone's immersed in whatever they're doing. What I need to do is create immersion in the same way. I need to create those faces on my students in an online world as well as a physical world. So I then start to ask myself these questions. Before we look at these questions, Alan, is there any other Twitter feeds that you want to raise? No? Okay. These questions have stayed with me for my whole academic career in higher education and also health education. So today I use these questions when I'm writing something for online. If I'm trying to write a new course, I will use these questions to provoke my thoughts. And you can see that the words behaviours, emotions, rewards, engaged and communicative comes up, and the story. The storytelling has been around for a while. Storytelling is extremely powerful. It's still powerful. When you write things for online education, I refer to it as the contextual voice. And the easiest way I can describe this to you is, if you've ever read a child's book before they go to bed at night, there's some words on the page that tell a story, but you fill in the gaps and you give the voices. You talk about the dragons and you talk about all sorts of things. You put the noises in. What you're doing there is you create the contextual voice that the story becomes alive and visual for the child before they go to sleep. When you're doing that for an online audience, you need to do the same. You need to create those sort of contextual voices that will tell the story, the compelling story, create the images, make the words powerful enough to actually describe what the dragon looks like. And the bottom question I keep posing myself is, how do I know when the students are learning? They're online, they're at a distance, I may not see them, I may not be able to phone them up, etc. So how do I know that course is working? Apart from the attrition rates and the results at the end, how do I know that each week that when they're online, how do I know that they're learning? Because after all, as teachers, what we want is feedback. We want to know we're good and we can do what we do. Yeah? Because when you do presentations, you never get the feedback that you get, do you? but you want it. You know you want it. It's an innate behavior that we have. So how do you know when you're online and the student's online and the student's learning? Because you need to tease out some of the feedback. Now, one way I've done this is I invite the students to actually do some problem-based learning online. And what I mean by that is I pose a problem, but I pose it in soft language, not colloquial language, a soft language that goes along the lines of Columbo. If anybody's of the same age as me and remembers Columbo, the guy with the old raincoat, the American, the policeman, he would do this on his head and help me out here, yeah, with a cigar in hand. I use that type of approach. Hi, if I know the student's name, I'll say, hello there, hi, it's Brian. I'm just having a bit of a problem here. I'm not quite sure what this means for me. And what I'm doing there is I'm reaching out to the students to say, help me. I don't quite understand. And when you throw a call for help, students like to come back, because what you're actually doing is you're leveling out the playing field on the power relationships between the teacher and the student. So what I'm doing all the time is trying to open up the students so that they will give some discourse and some feedback towards me. And I often find that students will write to me separately once they've answered things on the discussion board to say, I hope that was okay. And I'll write back to them and say, thank you for your contribution, it really helped me understand. So I'm looking all the time, I'm looking at the subtext of language, I'm looking at modalities of language as well to try and pick out the keywords that a typical student would say to me and give me indications of if I'm doing okay. And what I'm doing all the time with that information is I'm placing it into my pedagogical learning design. And this is mine. This is what I use every single time. And this came out of a piece of research that I did in 2005 that I published in 2006, 2007, and 2008. When I'm sitting down looking at writing things for our online audience, especially with simulation, I have a number of planned stimuluses. How do I get the audience engaged? How do I keep them engaged? I also have the point at the bottom here where it's communication. I'm looking for communication continually. I'm not looking for people to jump in and jump out. I'm looking for continual communication. So it's discourse. It's going to happen from the start. And I usually start at the beginning by saying this is a discursive session and it's owned by the students. So I'm setting up the state of mind for the students. The C part is content, micro-content. Rather than just one session, what I've done is I've looked at micro-content and I've showed that there is a contextual voice all the way through. So there's a story being told by the text. And the story, what's interesting sometimes is the story changes because the student changes the direction. So in problem-based learning, you might have 4 different directions, sub-directions. So a student would choose direction 1, and it would go off in a different tangent. Or 2, it would be a different tangent again. So what we try to do is create some flexibility so that students can choose what's the right or wrong outcome of the scenario being posed. And at the top there, I've written arousing curiosity. That's what I'm trying to do all the time. I'm trying to almost not give the information and give the end answer. I'm trying to give the information while asking for help to come up with different concepts. Yeah? So I keep things a little slightly open-ended, but also modeling behavior is important. So when I was doing this research stuff, to describe the classroom scenario, I had students in the classroom, I had a camera on me, I had a microphone, but I had students, another 25 students online in different geographic locations. So what I was doing is modeling behavior. The students online could see the classroom scenario, they could see me, and they can actually ask questions through Twitter feeds, but also put their hand up, they can actually verbally ask questions. So it's important to model the correct visual behavior, but also the written behavior too. So if I wanted to change a student's approach to how they would problem solve, I would give an example of how I would do it. And what was quite interesting in the research was that students start to pick up key words, and they would model those key words. They would actually use them within their own text. I was also keen to make sure that reflection took place continually, so that students had time to actually stop and think as they went along. So it wasn't just a case of here's the information, absorb it, and at the end do some reflection. It was about reflection, maybe apply back into practice, then come back again, ask further questions. And we ended up with this sort of jumping effect taking place. Students were not going through a linear approach, which initially was designed that way. They were actually jumping back and forward. So when they got to the end of the course, what was really pleasing for me is people were going back to day one of the course, and they were actually saying that they were getting something different. They went back and done the simulations again. Yeah,
So
sure. Yes, sir.
UC is an activity?
It's content. It's content with activity. Yeah, it's
Activity or theory or
it could be a learning object. It could be theory. What we use the acronym is PAA. There's a preloader. So before they even get into the session or get to the classroom or online, there's some information for them to think about. There's an augmented stage where they actually augment aspects, and then there's an application stage. So each is micro. So it's not 12 weeks long. It could be anything. It could be down to 30 minutes. It could be an hour. It depends on what your model is. But it was good to see that students were going back and forth. So the scaffolding effect of being flexible was allowing them to move back and forth. And I've mentioned already that what I was trying to do is connect the people in the classroom to the online world. Hence why we use Twitter feeds here, because both sets of environments have rich experiences, rich conversations to take place. And it just seemed rather odd that we would keep the online students separate from the classroom students. It'd be great if we can harness the collective intelligence by connecting them all up together. Yeah? And that interconnection, like I said, was done through a video camera and microphones. Now here's some of the findings that we found from that study. 35% of students who came to the classroom, so I started off with 75 students in total, came to classroom. After week 3, 35% of them had migrated completely to online. And so they never came back to another session again. But they were still there, we hadn't lost students. What they were seeing in the classroom was the same as what they were seeing online. It gave them confidence to go back and do things online. And these were people, when you dig into the data, these were people who were saying, I don't do technology. I don't have a computer at home. So these were real reticent people towards using technology, which was fine, because not all students are comfortable with using technology. But it's interesting, 35% migrated. Yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt. Some new tweets coming through, and thanks for pointing me out. I'm actually looking at the wrong Twitter area, so I kept reporting. There's no Twitter, coming through. Just a couple of observations, and as well as a question. I think one of the I'd like to point out is about how do you keep the story going when you talk about storytelling.
Yep.
And I think in terms of how do we know learners are learning, I think you already covered about having feedback, both online and traditional form. And the other one, if you may talk about how do we need to justify, do we need to justify stimulating environments against traditional pedagogies if our approach is integrated? Would you like to?
Yeah, I'll take the first one. The first one was
about how do you keep the story going?
Yeah, the story going for me is I usually sit down and write the story at the beginning, and then I have additional triggers in the storyline. So please forgive me if you look at the best soaps that are on television, and look at the soaps have a very long storyline over probably about 3 months. But then they have some trigger points. The editors will take the trigger points, and wherever way the viewing rating is looking at the SOAP. If there's a significant point on a SOAP that has hit the public and there's an outcry or there's whatever message is coming forward from the public, the trigger points will be worked up by the editor to follow that direction or go against that direction. So what I do is I look at having trigger points ready. So every week I come on and I might do 1 or 2 hours a week with students, and I'll have a trigger point ready for that week. This is what I'm looking for. This is what I hope to see. And if I don't see it, I'll throw the trigger point in, and it will encourage the students to come back and go, oh, that's a wild card. Let's try and answer that.
Were you working with medical cases in what you're describing as students within medical scenarios?
Some are medical, some are sports, some are MBA, business management as well. So it works across different geographical centres. Yeah.
Because I know it works very well with medical cases. I used to do this at St George's with online public-based learning.
Right.
Because medical cases have a natural storyline.
They do.
But,
Yeah.
yeah, but of course you can apply it to other things.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And the second question?
I think the second question is about do we need to justify stimulated environments against traditional pedagogies if our approach is integrated? So we're having a sense of whether do we need to have a different approach of physical environment or online environment? Do we need a different model of e-learning?
Yeah. One of the things I learned from the research I did was that if I wrote the teaching session through the eyes of the online learner, someone I would never see and who might be 4,000 miles away, if I wrote it through their eyes, through their body, their feelings of emotions, and what would stimulate them, I could actually apply the same pedagogical principles in the classroom. So every material I write, even for a physical session, I write it through a distance learner. How would this distance learner feel? So your pedagogy can be the same, but you have to reconcile that there are slight differences with an online pedagogy with a classroom pedagogy. The classroom, you obviously use the facial experiences, the movement on the seats, etc. Whereas online, you don't have that. You tend to create hyper acuity of the senses. Your senses become more aware when you're online. So if your pedagogy is written in such a way through their eyes, their feelings of a distance learner, it will apply to the classroom. If you do it from the classroom environment to online, there's always a mismatch for some reason. So it can be the same, but you need to take into consideration all the senses.
I guess, one of the experience we had when we were in the team, an academic colleague gave us, a PowerPoint presentation and said, can you make it online? Can you just put it up, on the blackboard? That's what we use. So all our students from 1,000 miles away, they can see my PowerPoint. That's e-learning, isn't it? And what we said, to our colleague is, would you expect a student coming into a room and the PowerPoint, just play by itself without any interaction, without any prescription or the contextual wrap and explain what they're going to learn? How would you find that experience? And if you take that approach and looking at your e-learning design, you will realize I need to give a little bit more description of what they're going to learn in this session. How would I expect them, after reading my PowerPoint presentation, do I want to have any feedbacks from them by maybe engaging with a dialogue, like what I'm doing with you, at the moment? If so, then that's where you'll find your answer. Apart from the PowerPoint slides, alone may not be enough. Think about, if you are talking to them as if, in the class, that will be, I think, one of the kind of common, issue that we deal with, when someone asking about the e-learning approach.
Great, thank you, Alan. Just a couple of points in this slide that I really want to point out to you. One was a phenomenal situation that happened that I never bargained for. The students accessed the online environment 22 hours out of 24, and I couldn't believe that even students at 2 o'clock in the morning were online. I thought I was the only crazy person doing studying at that time, but there was only a fallow period, and that was 2 hours between 3 and 5. And I still don't understand why, but students were finding that they can customize their learning experience when they wanted to do it. So yeah, I had students who weren't working night shifts or day shifts or etc., but were going on at 1 o'clock in the morning. And what I was finding was that I didn't need to be there. They were actually engaged in the discussion. They kept the discussion. They were developing the story. They almost got into story writing themselves. And that was a real fascinating occurrence for me. And that's the point I was going to make about there was high communication with good modelling practice taking place. It was almost that the students had become the teacher. And this would relate to Gilly Salmon's e-moderating model, where you've got the 5 stages. But I think there's a 6th stage of Gilly's model, and I can say that comfortably because I think there's a peer teacher, peer mentor approach on that 6th stage, where that once you've actualized the stage 5, you go beyond the rhetoric and you can actually do something much more fantastic by keeping it going. So just moving on briefly, I'm conscious of time. This is the actual pedagogy that I realized myself through discussions with the team, through working with other people. And it was the one that was published in 2008 after being peer reviewed by the Open University. My approach here was about changing the locus of control. And what I mean by locus of control is the experience is not owned by me. The experience is owned by the students, the masses. So what I was doing is I was writing the content, but I was saying, you're in control. And that was quite strange for some students, but that effectively that's what happened at the end of it. The design of it, etc., gave control over to students. I also, the significant part was about creating the convergence between online and classroom, not as a mode of delivery, but a mode of learning. So it was about creating opportunities, spaces without walls, for individuals to actually learn. And making sure that the learning was context-centric. And what I mean by context-centric is that if you look at situated learning, if the best place to learn something is in business or in the operating theatre or in a primary school where you're teaching, that's the place that you place the context-centric. So if you want as a simulated environment to be set up fully, it needs to be in a context-centric way. And it can be done online. So I had 3 prongs to the actual model, that the role of the tutor, the curriculum design, and the communication for learning had to be balanced. If you take one out of the equation, it doesn't work. If you make sure that the role of the tutor is understood by the students as well as the teacher, in that they will interject, they'll give stimulus, they'll arouse curiosity, they'll be there as a co-learner rather than the actual teacher themselves. You tend to level the playing field, and the curriculum design creates this contextual voice that tells the story as you go along, which then stimulates the communication for learning to take place, the discourse between students. There is a link at the bottom that you can click on and you can go to read the research paper. All this created a lot of curiosity for me. You know, I was 5 years into higher education, really excited by this phenomenon that was taking place. The university was really exciting because it was something completely different in innovation, and we had the same aspiration as yourselves. We wanted to move a lot more into online education, but we didn't know how to. So this model starts to be developed in such a way that other people were trying it in university. But if that wasn't enough for me, at the same time I was playing around with Second Life. And Second Life, as some of you will already know, is a 3D world, a metaverse. Some people call it a game, but it's not. It's more than that. It's a real life existence, but in a virtual world. And the thing about this world for me was it was giving me an opportunity to take the 3D simulation that I had in the physical world with medical students or other students and try to take them into a virtual world that would make a difference. Yeah. Now, at the time, the technology wasn't well developed, and I'm sure some of you will remember the conversations, and people were a bit cautious on it. The technology was very bandwidth hungry. was very graphic, hungry as well. And there was a lot of clunkiness. You were walking into walls, etc. So simulation became problematic. But since then, it's developed significantly to the point that here's me in my virtual home. And I actually use, maybe I look a bit more slimmer there, I don't know, but the virtual world for me now allows me to interconnect with people around the world. So I do a number of presentations from my virtual home, and the pictures that you see on the wall are actually designed by me because I'm an artist as well outside. So I furnish this in such a way that it replicates my own physical house, so I can feel comfortable to be able to do a presentation to Australia or online, or I can conduct business meetings. So I have a number of people who will meet me at a certain time in the Second Life environment and will come and have a virtual meeting with me. And it's at first it feels different, but more importantly, it gets the work done and it helps me to actually make good use of my time. Now you might say to yourself, oh, you can do that with WebEx, or you can do that with Skype, or you can do that with any video conferencing. Yes, you can. But the 3D world gives you a sense of presence, a sense of the avatars in front of you, a sense of a real person's behind it, compared to a two-dimensional picture just of an individual or a voice in your head. It gives you the conditions, the Garnier conditions of helping you be immersed in that experience. Do you want to say that? Yeah?
Telepresence is what, This is what research is.
Yeah.
So I don't know of any research that says what you just said, so I'm interested. What you just said was, if I understand it correctly, that telepresence is stronger in a 3D world like Second Life than it is
Correct.
through Skype.
And there's lots of research papers that we can share. David?
What's the phrase Harvard used, Brian?
Snapping into presence.
Snapping into presence. So you really feel as though you are there, not sat at your desk at home working your computer. I think that's the real significant impact of that world, that you can create these places to go to and converse.
This is interesting. It's disembodiment, though. So you move from this body into that body.
Yeah.
Into cyberspace.
Yeah, yeah. Once you get, you start for the first hour, you've got this internal voice asking you, is this the right thing to do, and so forth. But once you get into the second hour of your first experience, you become lost in it, in the sense of completely immersed. Especially when there's a dedicated intent and activity to do. So for me, it's about business, it's about doing conversations, it's about presenting. If there's a definite intent, I'm lost in there. And I spend about 4 hours a week in this environment, doing business. Yes, sir?
So it's fascinating, because then it's interesting about emotion. So you talked about a lot of emotion in learning earlier, because then the emotion's actually in this body. And if I'm in there, where's the emotion? So I just concentrate in that.
Okay. Lip synced, the avatar's lip synced, so when you talk, it'll talk, move, etc. And if you can create gestures, and sort of stand in different ways, poses, etc. But also the hearing senses, you start to hear more. In terms of hypercuity of the hearing senses, you hear people's undertones as well as the overtones. You actually hear more, and that was interesting for me because I never heard it before until I started using Second Life. And one of our colleagues in New York actually pointed it out even more to me recently, that the senses become much more in tune with what you're hearing, so you can actually read between the context. So I tried it on my students. I tried it on my students. It sounds like I did a sort of a guinea pig approach. And I was finding that when we congregated in this particular area, and this is the work of the Imperial College in London, and they spent a lot of money devising this campus, and it was amazing work that they've done. But they also invited people to come in and have a look, etc. So I used it a couple of times where I was able to have tutorials for students. So I had students in different geographical locations who didn't want to physically move or drive to the campus. So we set up a time and date, when they can come along with their dissertation and they can actually discuss key parts of their dissertation, and they would walk away feeling that they had an engagement with Brian. And those students felt very, very satisfied. But the thing with those students was that there was an element of cajoling and encouraging them to try something different. And it worked for them. And they came back and said, we want a bit more of this and more. So it was about agreed times, confidentiality that we had to consider, respect, and these are all things that relate to any online program or any online course. It's about making sure that you have an etiquette rules in place that are about confidentiality. You don't talk about things that you shouldn't be talking about, and that there is mutual airtime for everybody else to say what they have to say. And so that's, here's just a few other slides that I wanted to show you before we break for a drink. So I was getting to the point that this was a real creative space, a creative opportunity for simulation especially to take place. And it wasn't just about medicine, it was about any simulated experience that you could feasibly take from a physical world and transpose it into this environment. My experience of law and order in the US, University of Central Florida use this consistently through their law enforcement, their policing courses, where you can simulate a bar brawl. There's a casualty on the floor, they're being shot with a gun. The student law enforcement individuals go in and they start a sequence, an algorithmic sequence of how to treat the scene area, how to pick up the gun and put it in the bag, etc. So all those things can be simulated in the sequential manner. In healthcare, we start to look at things around healthcare practice. There's a heart murmur centre where you can go in and you can meet the patients. So you're using patient stories where you can actually diagnose the patient by placing the stethoscope. You're the avatar, you place the stethoscope over the heart, you hear the heart sounds, you hear the basal sounds of the chest, etc. You then come up with a diagnostic, and you've got your supervisor at the side of you who you turn to, and you can actually interact and say, this is the best thing for this patient. So simulation can be done, it's just about making sure that you've got all the right sounds, etc., and all the conditions in place. Then I start to realise I'm getting a bit fanatical about this, and I quite enjoyed being in this environment. What else could I do? Then I start to sail, and I'll be the first person to say I'm not a very good swimmer. So water is a problem for me. But in this environment, I was able to go and jump in the boat and sail off to a destination that I would never go to in the world, the physical world. But I was able to interconnect with people. I was able to meet other people. And it'd be quite surprising if I told you that those people on the beach there, I actually met one or two of them and chatted to them and found that they were academics in other institutions I ended up swapping details with. So offline, we were having Skype conversations about potential research projects as well. So it was just one of those things that I was able to do in terms of building relationships. And that's what simulation can do as well, because there's a shared problem. Then I realized there was opportunities for reflecting. And this is me in my chauffeur-driven car, waiting for the chauffeur to take me to Paris in Second Life. And I have found this particularly good for me, because any individual today is a very busy individual. Higher education is extremely busy, but how much time do you actually get to sit and reflect on your week, your activities? I find by going into this environment, the few hours a week that I have, I'm able to sit and reflect and ponder over things, but also play out different scenarios if I can rewrite history and go back into the real world and actually do something different. So it gives me an opportunity to reflect and practice. And then it brings me back to, potentially, I can create these faces amongst my students. That concentration, that engagement, and the emotional responses, and certainly desire to succeed. Now, this is an actual study done by a photographer, and there is a link to this. This photographer took these pictures of people who were gaming, into games, and identified those are the style of faces. Now, I don't know about you, but I would love to see those faces in my physical and online classrooms, because it's telling me that they're immersed. Yeah? So if they're using a simulated environment to play games, we need to understand the gamification elements that helps us to take that into our higher education experience. So it gives them an epic journey. It gives them an opportunity to collaborate with other people, to find the golden egg, the hidden jewels. But if we can transpose that into higher education, we've got a real rich opportunity in front of us. And then there's, of course, this one that many of you in this room will be playing today, Candy Crush. Modern day Rubik Cube, sequencing, algorithmic, processing, getting rewards, feeling good about yourself, feeling that your needs have been satisfied. Yeah? The makers of these games have a similar pedagogical visual model that they use. So they don't just come up with the idea and make the game. They have a sequence that says, what behaviors am I trying to elicit? Well, how am I going to stimulate the individual? Yeah? How am I going to reward them? How am I going to keep them invited and immersed in this simulated experience? Charming, yeah. Alan, any questions at this point?
There's a number of really interesting points, been raised in the Twitter, and some go to about, I don't know whether I read it correctly, focus of control that go to student role clarity is key, and being context-centric is important. So very good observation. And I think someone also interested about what would you say with your avatar in your second life?
What would I say is my avatar?
Trying to say with your avatar in your second life. And I think I've just got one, something about interconnection in second life leading to real life collaborations. But I don't know what people's take on, maybe not in second life kind of level. Does any of you play PlayStation 3 games? No? Anyone you know that they play? Xbox? Yeah?
We're not good. We're just not going to admit it.
Well, I think not necessarily the same kind of environment, in second life. But when I admit, I play PlayStation 3 games, and I do play, other kind of Wii game. What I found is I may not necessarily being the character in what I see myself in the game, but I do log into, a similar kind of environment where suddenly I become Lara Croft. I become, a Formula 1 driver that I don't think I will ever become, too. But I log into that kind of role-play model where I thought every day I can't go into my Gran Turismo game and I will compete in a different level of competition. And should I reach a certain level, I got a reward either by points or I will get the reward by ability to drive another car. So that kind of kept me interested, to keep going back to the game and try to become what I wanted to be. So that may not necessarily the same kind of environment or impact on the second life, but I think the gamer and using a very similar model and trying to engage with the player. So
absolutely, and that's human existence. We want rewards. We want to feel that what we are contributing to whatever conversation that we've got has been heard, but also been acknowledged, and we look for that feedback. And that's what you're referring to. And the levelness of challenges as well is important. Certainly in an online environment, you need to make sure that it's not just one level of challenge, it is stepped change. So when they first get into the environment, that they want a nice, easy, comfortable into it, and then you want to start stepping it up so it gets not more difficult, more challenging for them, so that it keeps them immersed. Because if you keep it level, they'll lose interest. Yeah. These are some of the questions I still have and I'm still want to resolve. Yes, this lady.
I just wanted to ask you about identity, the issue of identity. That's one of the, one of the disadvantages that's been pointed at, the fact that you don't actually know who is behind the avatar that you're talking to. For instance, one experience that I had was I thought I was speaking to you. You mentioned earlier that you met an academic in Second Life, and I thought I was chatting with an academic in Harvard University, actually. But I found out that he wasn't an academic in Harvard University. Much down the line, it was actually, just an avatar, a UK who lives in the UK.
Right.
So, we find that out later on. So there's this issue of not knowing who you're actually talking to, or not being sure that who you're actually talking to is the person that you think it is. And if you now translate that to students, so you don't know if it's your student that's actually in your session, and anybody can just come in and walk into your session, unless you make it a closed island or something.
Yeah, I got the point, really. In Second Life, you have First Life and Second Life profile, so you can actually access the First Life profile. And if there's nothing in there, the first thing I'm going to do is probably ask questions about that individual. And I'm looking for telltale signs in the language and the text that they might do on the instant messaging to tell me. So it's about reading the submodalities, the subtext of the text, to see if there's congruence between what they say in one line and they say in the next line. So that's about getting into the psychology of language and actually digging deep into it. And David's agreeing there. That's what helps me understand, there's a connection here, this is congruent, or I need to challenge this. But I do rely heavily on the First Life profile. And the second point you were raising there about students in a VLE, for example, in Moodle, how do you know that your student is the student in Moodle? The point there is you don't. You hope that's the right student because the student is there, signed up and signed a declaration that any work that they'll put forward to the university is their work. And if they put someone else in there as themselves, they're running a risk of being removed from the program. But hopefully, again, that gives you a chance over the weeks to actually look again at the text, the language that they talk in the VLE. So again, you're analysing the text all the time. And what I've noticed, certainly in 2004, 2005, was sometimes there's an alteration between language. You can tell the difference between one person's language and another. If it's not consistent in every single thing that they blog or post, you've got a chance to go back and just query it. Yeah. So I do take your point. A closed environment would be better, but there needs to be we need to be more aware of building up profiles of the individual's language as we see through text. David, did you want to say anything?
I think it's a really important, fascinating question that you've raised. This whole arena of emotional intelligence, and, bring ourselves into the real physical world. If we're all honest with one another, we've all been hoodwinked and duped in our lives by some slime ball we've met, who appears, straightforward and honest and decent, but sometime down the line, I say you find out that this person is this complete slime ball. And it's what can be done, what can be helped in your arena of education to make these youngsters, when they come into the world of work, more deft, more smart, to, if you wish, give them a streetwiseness that when they are dealing with the realities of what life is like in organisations, they can see who's going to dump on them from a great height or who's going to be more supportive.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Yeah. Please do.
I think it's, you can't argue that being immersed in something is a very good way to learn.
Yeah.
Like, for example, going to Spain to learn Spanish.
Yeah,
It's much
yeah,
more immersive
that's right.
than that. And I was interested about simulation because my dad was a pilot. And that,
Okay.
of course, is, for me, that's the epitome of immersive learning. The simulators that he had to use those years ago, when I was growing up. So But what's crossing my mind here, I work in, I love technology, I'm a learning
Okay.
designer, I'm a pro, but that question keeps coming up of how much time, energy and expertise you need to create these environments that make people feel immersed. That's my first thought, because Second Life takes up Remy's entire job,
Yep.
isn't it? Or has done. It's a very huge building
But
environment.
there is a learning curve, an initial learning.
And you're going to have these academics coming in going, well, I totally agree with you. I want to give my students all this immersion. Can I do it by clicking my fingers? That's the question. The other thing is, I've been working on a course that's about study skills, very basic study skills. So I've developed these, they're PowerPoints, but you made me think about these because they are PowerPoint shows. So I've taken the notes, the lecturer's notes, and added to the PowerPoints to make them work on their own. So I've done that. But some of the subjects are quite dry. How do you paraphrase? All those things. How do you avoid plagiarism? How do you make an immersive learning experience when you're teaching something very dry?
Okay. First of all, I'll answer the question about time. What I found is that if I wrote things through the model I was using, with short contextual voices, the storytelling, I wouldn't go and write another PowerPoint presentation for a classroom. So I write one that feeds all. I would then go to people like Alan and say to them, here's the functionality that I would like to create, and this is how it connects into the behaviorism that I'm trying to elicit. And the first thing Alan would say to me is, right, okay, you've got Twitter, you've got Facebook that has that functionality, but what's the right one? And we would sit down together and he would help me work through what I'm trying to create in the student at the end of that experience. And it's only at that point I can then say, right, Alan, you're right, let's use that technology. So it's the partnership of using that technology. And so typical of my sessions will be, there's always a Twitter feed, there may be a bit of video, there may be a bit of a simulated scenario, but there'll be web broadcasts as well, people from different geographical locations broadcasting in, and there'll be a problem-based scenario. So what I'm looking there is to try and interconnect them all together, and if I cannot interconnect them, I've got a broken pedagogy. So I then put them together. I'll then sit down with colleagues like Alan and a few academics and ask for a critical friendship, and we'll take someone through it. And if they don't get the anticipated outcome that I'm expecting, the behaviour, emotional, and so on, I then have to go back to the drawing board. But we've got it down to a fine art now that we can actually write these things, and that's why I'm so delighted that I've got these people to actually talk to, because Mark Prensky, you all heard of Mark Prensky, the professor in New York, he said for every academic there should be 2 technologists.
I like to hear that because that keeps my job going.
Okay.
We've got more.
Alan, you go nowhere.
But just to respond, to some of the challenges, when people said, guess what, this is a very instructional thing. There's hardly any humor, excitement, going to how can I jazz it up? Can you guys think of some good images, that you can put it in? And my response has always been, as a graphic, designer, what do you think, does the image help to tell the story? If so, yeah, put it in. But if it's not, it's just a kind of decorative element. It's not important. But think about, I think when we talk about the journey, recently we developed a section for palliative care, and it's actually about giving consent to research. So the brief was, we would like to encourage nurses to help us, to conduct this research. And this is the PDF, what they need to, go through. Can you make it an interesting e-learning session? Well, I said, first of all, what would you like, them to achieve at the end of it? Do you want them to gain new knowledge, or these are already experienced people? I said, well, actually, they've already done, some work. It's almost like a refresher. That's why I think, PDF will do the job. Then our team sit together and we think about, what about some scenario? Can we do some scenario, to help them instead of telling them this is what you need to do? Give them a scenario. Ask them, can you point out, the area where they can, apply this knowledge? And throughout the session, we also inject, kind of reflection point. Stop and think. From your own experience, if this come up, what would you do? This is what the guideline said, but in your real working practice, can you achieve this? So the whole session, the way we do it was we asked a couple of academic colleagues to act as a props, and I basically used my mobile phone to take pictures, and I put it in almost like a comic strip to show, to tell the story. So that's tasty, from our response of the user. They found it more engaging. They say, we can all read the PDF, but how apply knowledge, that was the enjoyment, the kind of fun in that particular session, to test out what we read, from there. Can I apply this, So it may not be the grand scale of Second Life as such, or 3D, and because of the resources, we can only do the cheap and cheaper, pro. So we do a comic strip. So that's, I think, one of the approach you may want to consider. And instead of telling them, delivering, the instruction, but giving them a scenario, giving them a context, ask them to debate it, get them, work through the practices instead.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say, before we move to a break, just to give you another example, the University of Sheffield has used iPads with a piece of software called Erasma on it. So students come into the simulated environment with the iPads and they run the iPad over the mannequin. And the mannequin comes alive. It's actually a person that talks, etc. They run it down the body of the mannequin and they can see where the problem resides. They can actually see the anatomy inside. So there is some tools out there we can actually show you later if you want to. I think those are real innovations because it brings the physical world and the online world together in a cute way, and it's inexpensive. It doesn't cost much. Okay, that's enough for us at this point in time. There'll be other thoughts and other questions that we can have, but let's have a drink and let's keep talking, and there'll be an activity as we come back just to try and deepen this a little bit further, if that's okay. So thank you for listening so far. Thank you.